Thank you at home for joining us for the final episode of the 2020 Virtual Machines Plus Media event, the Disinformation Industrial Complex. And it seems like we're swimming in it right now, doesn't it? First we hear one thing, then another, and if you're scrolling through your social media feeds, it means you're probably there and back again. It all comes down to what you believe, who you trust, and where you find truth. But whose responsibility is it to get it right? The private sector, the government, yours, mine. And if you said to me, Sarah, I don't even know anymore, I wouldn't blame you. So to help us make sense of it all, we've gathered an esteemed panel here with us today. I'm thrilled to welcome to Machines Plus Media, Renée DiResta, Jonathan Ong, and Craig Newmark. Renée DiResta is the Technical Research Manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. Renée investigates the spread of malign narratives across social networks and assists policymakers with responses. She's studied influence ops and computational propaganda in the context of pseudoscience conspiracies, terrorist activity, and state-sponsored information warfare. Jonathan Corpus Ong is Associate Professor of Global Digital Media at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. His research on digital disinformation takes a global look and involves interviews with a range of workers behind so-called fake news factories. His work has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and BuzzFeed. He's also the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Television and New Media. And finally, Craig Newmark, the Craigslist guy, now fully involved in philanthropy. Most of that focuses in areas like cybersecurity, election and voter protection, and countering disinformation and related harassment. Now, these are Craig's words. He is a serious nerd, 1950s style, and also supports pigeon rescue. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very important conversation. So first, to kick it off, we're going to talk information, and today I hear the word unprecedented a lot. And Renée, I wanted to start with you. Why is today so unprecedented? Why is it so different than 10 years ago or even 1 year ago in reference to disinformation?
Yeah, so a couple things there. First, I would say volume would be the most ready answer. The breadth of topics, I think, is another thing. The breadth of actors participating in the space is another thing. The ecosystem changed in such a way that anyone can participate in running influence operations. And even as we define influence operations, there's a lot of people who point out that marketing and advertising are a form of influence as well, right? So we try to focus in specifically on things that are manipulative, directly manipulative in some way, in terms of distribution of content or behavior of actors or incorporation of fake accounts. And with COVID-19 in particular, what we've seen is some very blurry lines between what we would consider to be kind of domestic activism and things that kind of cross the line into manipulation. So I think that's why there's been so much attention paid to the problem. Per your point though, I mean, the disinformation, people being wrong on the internet, misinformation, all of these things have been going on for decades. It's really more a function of, I would say, volume and velocity at this point.
So you actually brought up one thing I wanted to clear up, and any of you can jump in. So we're going to talk today about both misinformation and disinformation. Does anybody want to tell our audience at home, for those watching who may not know what the difference is, give a little rundown of how you guys use those terms?
I'm sure I can tackle that from our kind of taxonomy. We use misinformation to refer to information that's kind of inadvertently wrong, and a lot of that refers to the kind of intent of the spreader. So if you see something and you feel compelled to share it with your community because you feel you believe it and you're motivated altruistically to kind of spread that content along, we consider that kind of falling in the realm of misinformation. If you are, say, a Russian troll pretending to be a Texas secessionist, pushing out Texas secessionist content, for example, you know that you are an authentic person participating in that process. And so we talk about disinformation as more of an intent to influence with a component of deception. So there's an intent to deceive that's built into that as well. People who are, again, sharing something that is inadvertently wrong because they believe it are very distinct from people who are actively trying to manipulate a community.
So Craig, I want to come to you now and talk a little bit about bad actors. Talk to me a little bit about this organized push for disinformation out there in the world. who's doing it? What are the ops that are going on? What are you seeing in the spaces that you're working in right now?
I rely on the work of people who are doing much better work than I am. I'm coordinating some of it. I'm funding some of it. One of those groups is the Stanford Internet Observatory, where Renée works. So I defer to her. From what I'm hearing, from what I'm seeing directly, the bad actors are basically a very small number of foreign intelligence operations and so on, who think of themselves at war with the US, but that's secondary to their domestic allies who are much more active, attacking and trying to destabilize the US. So while there is foreign influence, I'm much more concerned with the domestic operators who are attacking the election in particular. They're trying to help destabilize the US because that provides a lot of opportunities for them. Some people say that chaos is the growth industry, that motivates them. Others in fiction say that chaos is a ladder. No matter what perspective you take on it, the domestic allies of the foreign operators who have declared war, I'm much more worried about the domestic bad actors.
So we've got, the political bad actors, but then we have people who are in the misinformation game for profit. Jonathan, your work talks a lot about, marketing firms, as Renée brought up, and how these type of influencers are also making money, profiting from kind of the chaos that comes that up. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing there and what's going on in that space?
Yeah, for sure. So we published a report for NATO quite recently looking at the politics and profit spectrum in the disinformation space, that there's really a range of political motives, but also some are just doing it for money, right? And particularly in Asia, my region of expertise is Southeast Asia, and here we've got a whole range of actors who are not really in it for ideologically driven motives, right? So they're not here to push for like an immigration agenda or a xenophobic agenda. They're just there to get clicks. They're just to get there to get traffic to their website, and their skills are for sale to the highest bidder. So a colleague of mine, Lee Edwards, says particularly for public relations firms that disinformation is in the DNA of PR practice. And I think having this approach to not just think about disinformation as happening out there, being done by foreign agents, trying to destabilize democratic practice, but seeing it as part of normalized industry practice, kind of shades in the layers of complicity that ordinary people get into. So one of the findings of our work is that nobody is a full-time troll in this industry. So everyone has like a respectable day job. They do this for Coca-Cola in the day, and then they kind of do this for like a shady politician at night. And so this is a way in which they also justify this work to their friends and to themselves.
So let's talk about complicity for a moment. I think that when we think about disinformation, we're very linked to the social platforms. So, Renée, can you talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on what, the Facebooks and Twitters and Reddits of the world, what responsibility they have to all of us out there to either stop dis and misinformation, or on the alternative, just let it go and let me decide?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So there's a lot of the old disinformation and misinformation, traveled on kind of broadcast media, where at least everybody saw most of the same things. And as a result of that, when there was something that was wrong or a hoax, or there were ways for other entities to kind of correct the record. Everybody could have a conversation about it. In the era of personalized media and personalized social networking, and the experience of being pushed into particular online groups through things like recommendation engines, through the targeted ads you receive. There's a much more personalized experience that lends itself at times to what we call bespoke realities. You see the things that are in the group that you are a member of, and that's it. And so that creates a very different dynamic for people to, per your point, kind of take responsibility in the sense that, well, yes, we want people to still have agency. There is this dynamic by which the sources that they see are funneled in very interesting and unique ways that we've not really quite had before. As far as the foreign state actor specific, that particular piece of it, that is a function that the platforms have taken responsibility for. They are the only people who can, and that's because even outside researchers like us, we can see things and we can flag them and we can say this looks anomalous, this looks like something that we believe to be inauthentic according to that rubric of kind of behavior, actor authenticity, and kind of emergent content types. But outside researchers can say this looks anomalous. We can't make that attribution ourselves. So when it comes to looking for the actual state-sponsored influence operations, that's become a much more collaborative process, but it is still one that the platforms have to ultimately be leading in terms of having these integrity teams and people who are out there actively looking for election manipulation and election interference. The volume of content is so vast that even when there are certain pieces that one researcher or another sees, we don't have visibility into the entirety of the, the group dynamics, the secret groups, the private groups, the vast kind of collection of spaces in which interference can occur.
Craig, did you want to say something?
Well, you were asking about the responsibility of different platforms regarding this. And this is a subset of journalism ethics, specifically about the ethics of distributing news. And as I speak to the ethicists, they say very clearly, it is not ethical, it is not trustworthy to distribute, to amplify disinformation. If you know something is false, or if you know that your source is normally a source of disinformation, then you should take action regarding that. If you know it's false, then you might not allow it on the platform, or you might do something like encasing it in a truth sandwich. You might warn people that you're about to report on a lie. You might allow the lie to be repeated, and then you tell people, this is a lie, and here's why. The idea is that if you're a news distributor, whether you're a newspaper or a social media platform, it is untrustworthy to knowingly amplify disinformation. It is untrustworthy to amplify a news source normally guilty of disinformation without acting in good conscience.
So do you think that calculus changes at all if your disinformation spreader or super spreader, so to say, is a politician versus something that just goes viral versus something that just a regular citizen or member of public says, as it relates to how the social media platforms would handle it?
Well, I'm kind of simple-minded and old, and about 60 years ago, Mr. and Mrs. Levin in Sunday school said that it is not right to bear false witness. And disinformation is best defined by the phrase false witness, and it's wrong for anyone to do it. And we need to work together on this. This is an all hands on deck problem. So forgive me my simplicity, but disinformation from anyone is not okay.
So Jonathan, we are seeing a lot of response from the US-based social media platforms going into the election of 2020 here in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the global response, how both the American-based platforms have responded globally to mis and disinformation, and how some of the platforms based outside the US are handling this issue?
Absolutely. So far, we're talking about disinformation and lies from politicians. So looking at it from a global context, we have to bring in the issue of hate speech and hate speech that incites to violence, which it was a United Nations body that had found that Facebook had, in a way, enabled this kind of hate speech to proliferate on their platform in Myanmar. And I think that makes this issue of platform bans, fact-checking, what kinds of content would stay, what needs to be taken down, it becomes so much more urgent in the global south, and particularly in the regions that I've been looking at. So here, we feel that when you talk to global scholars, platforms are not doing enough and not responding fast enough, especially to fast-moving crises of this nature. So I think the Myanmar case is actually quite interesting to think about in global context. So it was the commander-in-chief and military officials who were deplatformed of a Facebook. And so that because of those particular findings. And so should that in a way kind of set a precedent for the global north as well? So that's one important question. Another issue is about how platforms can also be working with journalists and local fact checkers and supporting them as well. So what we've seen in Southeast Asia is that Facebook has partnered with local fact checkers, and here the incentive systems aren't really super fair. Like they get paid quite minimal, modest amounts for fact checking and being exposed to all of that fake news right on their platforms. But journalists who themselves are being attacked and beleaguered and they have lower advertising money now, they actually welcome this kind of income as a source of income for them. So I think we need to be engaging platforms more systematically, and they need to be investing more resources outside of just the global north. So the most active users in social media are in countries of Brazil, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and they should also be allocating more resources here.
So I think that, we're doing this very different here today than we've done in past years. We're all at home because of COVID-19. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how this COVID-19 crisis specifically has completely changed the landscape for dis and misinformation. I think, we all are very used to hearing conspiracy theories and other things that's what maybe previously would pop into people's heads. But now we've got very real life and death situations going on across the globe for a lot of people. Renee, could you talk a little bit about how you see specifically COVID-19, like how this is kind of unraveling out there in this space, and maybe what you would advise state and local officials, the State Department, the government, anyone who will listen, help, exactly, to help fix it.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
All right, let me think about how to break this one down. So we have a project at Stanford Internet Observatory called the Virality Project. And it's kind of a double entendre between, of course, COVID, it's our COVID study project, and then the way that information spreads, the kind of online virality of messaging. And what we've chosen to do on that project is we look at the narratives that are emerging in 7 or 8 different regions globally. And so not just the US, but also China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nigeria, because COVID is unique in that it is a truly global information event, so to speak, right? We've had epidemics in the age of social media before. Zika, Ebola, multiple measles outbreaks. And in all of those cases, there's been a capability in that the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization and others understood the dynamics of the disease itself, which meant that even though there were rumors and hoaxes, fake cures and grifters and the usual dynamics, Bill Gates conspiracies, there was still a sufficient offsetting amount of reputable information from regular communications from health authorities because they understood what was going on. Measles, there's a vaccine, there's a known treatment, et cetera. Zika, Ebola, to some extent, the same thing. What we see with COVID is first sustained attention. So this is not going away. Global attention, meaning the entire world is paying attention because the virus hops, of course, from place to place. We see kind of quack cure or unproven cure, you know, so hydroxychloroquine was not, of course, a quack cure, that was just an unproven or experimental cure. The dynamics are very interesting in that you have the actual quack cures, the grifters who are selling colloidal silver and vitamins, right? And then you have the unproven cures. There's different dynamics in the motivations for those actors. The people who are selling the quack cures have an economic motivation. A lot of the conversation around the unproven cures is just people who are speculating because there's no new information coming out. And when you don't have a steady stream of reliable information, the content that fills the void is just, it's literally whatever the algorithm returns in response to the keyword, right? Hydroxychloroquine, we did a study going back and looking at last year, only people in the lupus community in the United States were talking about that drug because it has, you know, medical uses for that community. But what you start to see is activity on social media around that topic, beginning actually in Taiwan and Hong Kong and other places where the virus emerged first and the potential for that treatment, you know, became a topic of conversation there. And you see it gradually actually spread around the world. It goes to Africa, where they've used it as a malaria medication. It goes to other places that have heard of it before. And in March, it comes to the US. So by this point, it's actually been a topic of conversation in other parts of the world for about 2 months. So we have the really interesting opportunity to see how information moves globally, how when there's no centralized authority or leadership or findings, and in this case, that's partially a function of bad communication, you know, practices, and partially a function of them just not knowing. So we have this unique environment in which misinformation is just, it's so prevalent because good information isn't being put out because good information is not available. So we're expecting scientific researchers and scientific communicators, public health authorities, to be communicating with us at the speed of Twitter when that's just not a viable prospect in, you know, in a time when we need to be doing real scientific research to ascertain whether or not these things work. So the dynamics are pretty distinctly different. The other thing I would say, and I don't want to talk for too long, but it was a kind of a big question. That's on the sort of misinformation and you know, domestic actor side. What we also see is ways in which this has had very significant implications for state actors in terms of how their own populations see them managing the narrative domestically. So in China in particular, the sense that the CCP kind of fell down, right, didn't react quickly enough, didn't take necessary steps fast enough, led to kind of a crisis of communication for China domestically, which did begin, what you began to see was Chinese state ministers on Twitter speculating about whether the US had actually brought the virus to China. So you have these geopolitical conspiracy theories that, you know, begin to fill in the realm of, you know, public diplomacy and propaganda and kind of state tradecraft, trading blame for the virus itself. And that another dynamic you see is Iran saying that the virus was created for the genome of the Iranian people. And then Russia Today saying, people in Iran are saying that the US government created the virus, right? And so you have this proliferation then of conspiracy theories and disinformation pushed by state actors at the highest levels, really in service to allowing them to kind of alleviate blame for their own involvement in how they've handled the crisis. So it's two kind of almost parallel tracks, if you will, of bad information. One being pushed very much domestically, grassroots, lack of public health comms, and then the second is the very significant geopolitical implications for this particular disease.
Jonathan, I saw you nodding. Do you have some thoughts on this one, the big question?
Absolutely. Yeah, so just to build on what Renee said and the Asian perspective. So a lot of like folks see cures, right? In the realm of misinformation. So so these are mostly like older people in their chat groups, close groups as well on Facebook, kind of exchanging like folks seek cures. One day it's like banana as the cure. The next day it's like a steam bath or some other kind of locally promoted cure. And these are like local medical influencers who are perpetuating some of these. And then
do they get paid for that? Or is that just like straight up like sharing with your friends?
some of them would be selling like their own brand of vitamins, and that's always the most shameless ones. Others are more like well-meaning,
Mhm.
and it's always like your mom and your dad, like who's more susceptible and vulnerable to this kind of misinformation. But we're also super worried about like what happens when state actors, as Renee would point out, like would hijack this, right, to stifle dissent about their response. And what we've seen in across Southeast Asia are anti-fake news laws are being shoehorned into like a general COVID government package. And this is really a way to target ordinary people. And in the Philippines, it's like a school teacher and her son who face criminal charges. In Thailand, it's frontline health workers who criticize and try to expose corruption around hoarding of surgical masks, who now face criminal charges. And so these kinds, this crisis in a way is being used as that excuse to stifle government dissent and to consolidate their power.
Renee, I liked your comment that we expect answers at the speed of Twitter. It's like a new measure of time, right? So it occurs to me that, you know, you're exactly right. There is no answer to satisfy us, you know, when we come back from our walk, you know, an hour later. So do you think that a lot of this is coming from the fact that there is this vacuum, because not only don't we have the information, but the information that we do have, there's a certain subset of people out there, they don't like it. Like, and I'm thinking specifically of masks. So, you know, and where kind of that conversation comes in, because it's, you know, at least here in the US, I think that misinformation and disinformation around mask wearing is something that's really front and center to all of us. Craig, do you have any thoughts on on what's going on online with regard to COVID and masks and how this has become a politicized issue?
Well, bad actors look for any reason to generate outrage. Outrage for them is profitable. It helps them achieve their ends. They've detected a possible, well, an excuse to try to fake a culture war based on masks. They've successfully done so. Primarily domestic bad actors, perhaps with foreign coaching, are using the whole mask thing to divide our country, to polarize our country, and they're doing so without regards for the health or suffering of Americans or people anywhere. So from my narrow point of view, there's not that much difference with the pandemic from the point of view of information warfare, except that it offers a lot more cannon fodder for bad actors to use, and they, as ever, disregard the human suffering that they're causing.
So it seems like to me, from all of these answers that you've been given, a lot of the difference now than before is just the stakes that we're all dealing with for what's at stake if we don't kind of get a better handle on mis and disinformation. Craig, do you want to talk about what you think is at stake going into this election season?
Well, the objective of, let's say, the most energetic of our foreign adversaries is to destabilize the US. That's also the intent of their domestic allies. And the pandemic has proven to be fertile ground for them, except that lots and lots of Americans are seeing what's really going on here. People are seeing that they really do need to use masks, and even the natural allies of the domestic bad actors are beginning to say that, hey, the mask thing is real, we really need to do this. And so that may be turning the natural allies of our foreign adversaries in a positive direction. We see that in recent polling, where bad actors are getting less and less public support for doing what they're doing. There's a heavy price to be paid here in domestic suffering among the states where they've previously attacked mask wearing, but at least it's moving in a good direction now.
Jonathan, what do you see as what's at stake here?
Yeah, so again, the Asian perspective, we're among the best when it comes to mask wearing. So the Philippines tops the chart when it comes to mask wearing. So this really, bewilders me. Like, and I wonder whether is it a matter of like messaging? Like, is it like how can we improve this? Or is it like too much spotlight on those anti-mask protesters that kind of seem to normalize that this is much more widespread than it is? Like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this refusal to wearing masks here.
Yeah, it is a bit perplexing sometimes, isn't it? So Renee, do you have any thoughts on the stakes of this and where we should be going?
Yeah, well, I think it's with COVID in particular, it is a people, especially the school reopening now. I'm a mom of almost 3, and it's just the mask battles are extending down into the school battles now, and it's all like a big mess, and everybody's just angry all the time. I think there's no moral leadership that's really coming out at the top either, and this is another thing that in the nostalgic, quaint old days, I think people at least felt that there was somebody who would reassure the nation, and there was some leadership that would kind of step in that was seen as legitimate by both parties. I think Dr. Fauci, interestingly, kind of has emerged as maybe the best in that in that sphere of actors here, and watching the social media dynamics alternately trying to discredit him versus elevate him and build fan groups for him has also been an interesting dynamic. The stakes really are high. I mean, it's the same thing with the November 2020 election. I think, again, that idea of many people see this as, is this the election that actually restores that leadership with moral legitimacy in some way? And that is kind of a semi-partisan statement, I would say, but it's the kind of thing where there's just a sense that there's been such a vacuum for so long, and is there potential to change course in some way that provides people with a feeling that we have returned to a realm of facts. It's not clear to me that it's actually going to be as easy as that. It's, I think, going to be a highly divisive election, but the legitimacy of the election itself, I think, is one of the key areas that we're paying a lot of attention to at SIO as well, in a very nonpartisan way. Meaning, if there is an opportunity for foreign interference, if state actors come out and say, hey, we did in fact hack your voting system, or we did in fact run these fake pages, or we pushed this narrative, and sort of reveal their operation after the fact, does it in some way delegitimize the election? And will that be used to create a constitutional crisis? So I think there are very high stakes, both with regard to COVID and with regard to election 2020. And I think that those two things are actually perhaps more interrelated than just a regular, ordinary political issue. And that has been very interesting to watch that dynamic play out. A lot of the anti-mask groups are incredibly politically active and have been for some time. And so watching the dynamics of particular hyper-partisan sects that have taken up the mask call and then used that as a recruiting call, if you will, for related political activities has been very interesting to see as well. It's a lot of networked activism, and it's not all foreign interference. It's actually very much domestic.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've noticed as well, that there's this push now, or maybe it's because we're all at home, I'm not sure, but there's this kind of there's grassroots activism that's coming from behind a computer to make change in real life, right? And a lot of that is very genuine, but some of it isn't. Some of it is, it seems very authentic, but it's not astroturfing, I believe is the word that I keep on reading about. What are your thoughts, and this is for the group, what are your thoughts on how, how a lot of the domestic actors have kind of taken on this, this of the people type push that we've seen a lot lately, both in COVID and in the Black Lives Matter protests that have come on, but it's not real. It's dis and misinformation like coming at us. Craig, you want to talk a little bit about how you're seeing that?
Well, I see a lot of people who are angry for some legitimate reasons. I see a lot of people who just want to make things better, but a lot of folks are, if you're motivated by anger or outrage, you're easy marks for people who want to deceive you into building an astroturf army. Our foreign adversaries have been really good at this for about 100 years. They would enlist what they would politely call fellow travelers who would destabilize a country on their behalf. Again, fellow travelers is the polite term, and that's proven to be very effective, especially in the US over the last 20 years or so. They'll find people who are, again, legitimately angry. They'll find people who want to make things better and who are all gullible. It's pretty easy to manipulate them. And that's what we see sometimes when we open up Facebook or Twitter. Sometimes we'll see a lot of people who mean well, but who are hurting the very country and people that they seek to help. People are beginning to work on doing better with that, but that requires nuance, of which I'm not capable. That requires people who have social skills. I'm not one of them.
So we've talked a lot about Facebook and Twitter being kind of the big elephants in the room. What about the more emerging platforms like TikTok and the like? How do you see those sites, which now, they seem fairly innocent. I see kids outside on the streets of Brooklyn, filming their TikToks all the time. How are those that seek to deceive using the more emerging and up and coming platforms, especially the ones that target or are kind of primarily populated by kids?
Is that a question for me?
Oh, for any of you, yeah, go ahead.
Well, any of these media are being used as news distributors. I think they should all take some action regarding the amplification of disinformation. That's a really hard problem, whether you're a mature platform or not a mature platform. And I'd say go after the low-hanging fruit. It is not hard to identify the leading sources of disinformation, take measures to deal with that. The ones who are loudest, assign machine learning and people to monitor what they're doing, perhaps to do a disinformation check before you allow something to go out there. And that way you can prevent the amplification of disinformation. Some things you may not allow to get out there, some things you may want to surround with that truth sandwich kind of thing. But the fundamental principle, the old-fashioned thing is that false witness is just not right.
So this is for all three of you, what do you think it would take for the social platforms, big or small, to actually tackle this problem? They've all recently set out with a variety of methods, labeling or marking, letting us know that this isn't exactly right. And Facebook made an about face kind of just a few weeks ago about this. But to actually have meaningful change, what do you think it would take for these platforms? Is it regulation? Is it just hiring more and more and more people? How can they really fix it, for lack of a better term? Renee?
Yeah, I'm not sure so fix it is such a hard thing because there's so many different facets, even just to what people see as the problem. I mean, I am not a huge privacy person, but there are a lot of people who are, and you see a lot of the problem as like user data mining and targeting and these sorts of things. I would say when I think about this, there's sort of and this kind of relates to your earlier question too. This is an information ecosystem-wide problem. It is not a problem of a single platform. It's that the entirety of the information ecosystem, all of the apps, every new emergent app, just changes the play space a little bit and makes it so that an adversary who wants to use it has a slightly new and different way in which to use it, right? And that includes, by the way, broadcast media as well. For some reason, that's always held off separately, but it's really not anymore because most of the broadcast media properties have massive social media pages as well. And so this all becomes part of an all-encompassing information ecosystem. So when you think about what information ecosystems like should be doing, we have one that was largely designed to entertain that became a primary source for information, right? And informing and entertaining are two very different things. And so a lot of the curation and recommendation systems built to entertain are simply just legacy in a way, if you will, kind of architecture that is now used to inform. So when I think about it, I think a lot about, targeting and advertising and sort of these like personalization is an interesting wedge that we have some opportunity to evaluate. Then there is curation, right? All of your information is curated. This leads to political battles about whether the Republicans and Democrats have equal surfacing of, content in algorithms and so on and so forth. That's sort of in my opinion, kind of a little bit of a ridiculous partisan take on it. But the problem of curation is such a key thing because that's how people get their information. So thinking more holistically, if you will, or in more principles-based terms about what should be curated. And then as a second order kind of piece of that, what should be recommended? How do we think about what the platforms proactively push to people and the impact of that? And so I see curation, recommendation, and personalization as sort of three interrelated but distinct areas that each one could be thought through more strategically. Again, not as a void in the individual silo of one specific platform, but more about the way in which we think about how we get our information writ large.
Jonathan, do you have thoughts?
Well, I think with the ad boycott of Facebook, we can clearly see how money still talks here, right? And how platforms can actually quickly pivot and change their regulation overnight just because of threats around things that might hurt their bottom line. And so I still think that journalism, and very good journalism that exposes, that puts pressure, assigns accountability, that in a way kind of also shames these platforms to action, that has worked, particularly in Southeast Asia. So to support like good journalism around technology and tech regulation has been really crucial for activists and academics to be working with. And I think I see that many academics find new ways to collaborate with journalists and investigative journalists to put more pressure on them and keep them accountable.
Craig?
I agree about curation. Curation is the action of deciding what news you're going to distribute. And in my old-fashioned approach, I'd say just when you find something that you know is disinformation, either don't distribute it or distribute it letting people know that, hey, what you're about to distribute, for whatever reason, is disinformation, is a lie, and people should be prepared for it. I think everyone is involved with this because when this war started, roughly 1970, Marshall McLuhan said that World War III will be a guerrilla information war fought equally by civilian and military participants. And no, he was right. There is the military involved, but also civilians are involved, sometimes as fellow travelers, sometimes active maliciously. And a lot of the civilians, especially operating in the US, have gotten good at disinformation. But I have a lot of faith in the journalists and other editors on these distribution platforms, whether they're social media or newspapers. They have a pretty good sense of when they're being asked to pass on disinformation. When they're not sure, they can always slow things down and do a check. To be clear, we're not talking about censorship, which is a government action. We're talking about, when it comes to private platforms, people always have a choice whether or not they're going to amplify disinformation or stick with the truth.
So looking out into the future, then, I don't, it's hard to even predict to go out a month from now, right? But if you had to take your crystal ball out and look in 5 years into the future, where do you think we will be with this? Are you hopeful? Do you think that it's like, if it's going to get better, how's it going to get better? If it's going to get worse, how's it going to get worse? Who wants to start with that one? Jonathan, I'm gonna pick on you. I see you smiling.
Okay, I'll try to be hopeful. Where to begin? So I do think, well, first we need to be tracking innovations and see where disinformation will be going. And what we've seen really is disinformation actors, media manipulators play cat and mouse games with platforms. So we always have to be on the newest platform. So if it's TikTok, we need to understand and in a way kind of define what user behaviors are good and bad on this platform, what would be the norms that we should be holding. Also, even fellow activists and allies in this space, if they're going to use this to challenge disinformation, then we need to also come up with the right values and frameworks to judge that. So one thing that I'm worried about is how disinformation will become more and more micro targeted, so around close groups, around chat groups, and I think that will be harder for journalists to get into, to fact check. So that will be tricky moving forward. One thing that I am hopeful for is, I think more collaborations between researchers, activists, and journalists. I think that for us academics working in the disinformation space, we realize that we just can't proceed as normal with slow research, as careful as we want to be with the kinds of findings and interviews that we have with the respondents. We need to get this out there. If it means that it could protect some people's lives, if it could prevent disinformation from going viral, then we need to find ways to also hold each other accountable here. And I think we'll see more and more large teams of academics working with journalists and also activists and regulators, and hopefully come up with new solutions there.
Renee, what do you see when you look out into the future?
Yeah, we have that same model at Stanford Internet Observatory, which doesn't do any good to wait 2 years for a peer review when the ship has sailed, so to speak. So we also put out things pretty quickly. And I think that's the right call. And other journals like Harvard Misinformation Review have tried to keep that degree of academic legitimacy and rigor, while at the same time recognizing that a 2-year review process is just not a thing that works here. We believe in multi-stakeholder communication, and that's the thing that we also prioritize at SIO. And so we really try to think about how do we work with civil society and with journalists. Sometimes we get, journalists will send me interesting emails where like, hey, I'm seeing this thing, what do you think it is? And sometimes it's absolutely nothing. And other times it leads to a really interesting investigation. And so there is this interesting kind of framework by which those lines of, who does what and how does the work get done, I think we want to see that be as collaborative as possible. One thing I'll say on the state actor front, there's still no deterrence, right? This is the interesting dynamic. Your account comes down, that's it. There's no penalty, nothing else happens to you. There's no sanctions. There's no, maybe it's sometimes in the US that you eventually get the sanctions years later, but but there's just no cost. And so that I think is an interesting piece of this, right? Like the idea of zero cost publishing, that anyone can say anything they want to anywhere at any time, is a very unique power. And when that kind of disproportionate commitment to free expression that we see from liberal democracies does mean that when particular states decide that they're going to push information into our information ecosystem, we're very reluctant to take it down. We're very reluctant to treat it as malign. And so it does make democracies disproportionately vulnerable, which is an interesting challenge that I think we haven't fully reckoned with. That's a thing that does ultimately get decided at a much higher level of government, which is what should the cost be for adversaries to operate in this way, to deliberately interfere in elections, to run.
What do you think it should be?
Man, really basic. I testified in front of Congress on this back in 2018, August 2018, so almost 2 years ago. And the recommendation I had was that we needed to be treating influence operations needed to be thought of a little bit more as what we call information operations. So you wouldn't tolerate certain types of hacking. And in a way, the US has a system where we defend the walls of the castle, so to speak. I think this was like a Brookings metaphor that I really liked, while the enemies kind of poison the air, And so we're always thinking about how do you harden your infrastructure? How do you make your critical systems hack-proof, et cetera, while at the same time, what we see instead is going after soft targets to delegitimize and to erode confidence in elections or confidence in the political system, confidence in political leaders. And that is somehow sort of off in this realm of like things that are not dealt with, So was there a way to rethink our influence operations and information operations doctrine to just be more cognizant of the fact that increasingly hack and leak activity, what we call hack and lurk, where they just break into a system and let their presence be known without changing anything, because that itself is disruptive enough. Or as we saw with the kind of drama on Twitter last week, hack and commandeer, right? There's a lot of different ways in which you can use direct information attacks in service to influence operations and potentially have a bigger impact from the influence operation, actually. And so rethinking how we treat those types of activities and how we see this as a holistic issue, as opposed to the hack being a very big problem, but what comes next just being a problem of some media stuff. And I think that's where hopefully smarter people than me are thinking.
I was actually going to ask all of you about the Twitter hack. Do you think that will have any lasting impact on like trust in kind of these systems in the dis and misinformation space? How can we believe, Jeff Bezos is saying X when, Twitter just got hacked and 10 very important people, were part of a Bitcoin scam, right? Do you think it'll have any lasting impact, Craig?
Basically, I think people will remember it as another increment of distrust. But to answer your previous question right now, Renee is right to talk about influence operations, which is how our foreign adversaries and their domestic allies are attacking us. They're attacking us in two different battle spaces: social media, where the platforms are the gatekeepers, and mass media, where journalists are the gatekeepers. And pragmatically, the answer is, if they try to game the ref, if they try to propagate disinformation, I have a lot of confidence moving forward that journalists and editors will start to stop the amplification of disinformation. You saw some of that with Chris Wallace interviewing the president. On the social media platforms, I speak to people at high levels. One level below the C-suite, though, they're ready to start doing their part for the country. They're ready to stand up and do, I guess, what's genuinely the patriotic thing. They just need to convince their management. And I'm confident that they'll learn how to do that.
before the fall?
Uh, before our foreign adversaries have a major victory.
Well, that's hopeful. That's very hopeful, actually. So just kind of wrapping up today, I wanted, we're talking to a fairly sophisticated bunch out there. This has been a kind of a high level conversation. So, for all of the academics and executives and journalists listening out there today, we all are the victim. We all see dis and misinformation all the time. So for those of us who consider ourselves fairly sophisticated and fairly savvy, what advice would you give all of us to go that one step further and really protect ourselves against it, and do what we can to be a good corporate or a good citizen of the world? Jonathan.
So wasn't there a study that said that older people are actually more vulnerable to sharing fake news than younger people? I was actually surprised, like, when I talked to my students. I teach at UMass, so a large class of 300 students, 19-year-olds, and they weren't really familiar with Pepe the Frog as being a figure of the alt-right. And I thought, like, they would be familiar with those vernaculars. It's been written about by journalists. There's academic papers also written about it. So in a way, like, that also pushed me to think that no one should think that they're immune to disinformation and misinformation. So yeah, so just to educate yourself, read about not just also local trends, but also global trends, as they as these kind of media manipulators also learn from each other and adopt techniques that they see that other countries are doing.
All right, Craig, that leaves you. What do you got?
I think this is an all hands on deck, we're all in this together kind of thing,
Yeah.
where civilians got to participate along with the military even. And that means joining up with groups who are doing really good work, either in better understanding the nature of the attacks or participating in taking the battle to the enemy. And this is not only in the area of influence operations, it involves areas like cybersecurity. For example, the Girl Scouts of America have just announced that they're being supported by someone in terms of doing a better and better job of propagating their cybersecurity merit badges and related efforts to underserved girls in the New York area. That's a part of the solution. My gut tells me that may be a bigger part of the solution than we'd imagine. But lots of people are working together to rebuild the immune system of America to take the battle to the enemy, whether that enemy is foreign or domestic. And I'm pretty optimistic about that.
Okay, so Renee, you'll get the last word today.
We're trying to think of how to formulate something cohesive here. There's a lot of pointing at media literacy, helping people better understand sources, per what Jonathan was alluding to with different demographic age groups really do see very, very, very different things. Interestingly, we've actually seen a resurgence of some of the older kind of conspiracies from 2016 on TikTok, with younger people suddenly talking about Pizzagate, which was very bizarre, not something I would have predicted. Ways in which, again, once it kind of trickles down into a community, that community becomes impacted. Virality is, in fact, like it's a great metaphor. It's like an information infection. And so the question becomes, how do you think about tailoring these curriculums or helping people understand, for particular age groups that are using very different platforms and seeing information come through in very different ways. But ultimately, what a lot of it comes down to is, who do you trust for your facts? And that is, I think, the problem, where that's not something that regular people have as much, I don't want to say control, but the question becomes, can we build bridges of trust again, even between different political parties, different people who are on different sides of political aisles, work to restore trust in media and institutions, I feel like that's a bigger problem than technology, unfortunately. So all of the media literacy for understanding where your information, how your information hits your social feed, that can make you a more informed consumer, but I think ultimately there is that need to restore trust kind of between citizens with each other as well as citizens with our institutions. And this is where I think that lack of a moral authority that is resonant in a broad swath of communities, like that's where we need to be finding those people, those bridge builders, so to speak, that can do more to kind of repair the underlying issues as opposed to just fixing the technology problems.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us here today in this virtual panel to talk about disinformation. Renée DiResta, Craig Newmark, Jonathan Ong. Thank you very much. Goodbye.